All right, our last reading is by Irvine Deloria Jr., who passed away in 2005. He was an acclaimed author, a professor in the Department of History at the University of Colorado Boulder. He'd graduated from Ohio State University with a degree in general science. He served in the U.S. Marines. He earned a theology degree from the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. He earned a JD from the University of Colorado Law School. He's the founder of the Institute of American Indian Law and the Institute of the Development of Indian Law. And he's also addressing the history of activism, including Alcatraz, in his account of Native or Indigenous histories. But he goes more into more detail than just Alcatraz. There are a couple of key terms, key phrases that I want you to know. The Ku Klux Klan, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have heard of the Ku Klux Klan. They are a white supremacist terrorist organization. They have targeted Black people, Jewish people, Latinos, Asian Americans, Indigenous Americans, Catholics, immigrants, leftists, queer people, Muslims, atheists, abortion providers. They are a long-standing U.S. institution. There are several different iterations of the Klan, beginning as early as the mid-1800s into present day. They have a very interesting and complex history. There has been little federal penalty against Klan activity. There have been a couple of introductions of anti-Klan acts in federal government, but very little action taken against them. So that's the Ku Klux Klan. U.S. v. Washington is also called the Boldt, B-O-L-D-T decision, and it was from 1974. The Supreme Court heard about the use and right to harvest salmon and other fish as per the terms of a treaty with the United States. It's an important decision. The Boldt decision is an important decision as it affirms and reaffirms the rights of a tribal sovereignty in the U.S. So in the 1840s and 50s, there's more settlement happening into the Washington territories. And so, of course, they go into those territories. The U.S. goes into those territories, or the colonizers go into those territories, and they eventually create or enter into 10 treaties with Native peoples in that area, which included the Treaty of Medicine Creek, the Treaty of Point Elliott. In their treaties, one of the things that Native people stood firm on was their right to fishing, their fishing rights in the area. Medicine Creek and Point Elliott treaties have identical language which state, quote, the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory, provided, however, that they shall not take shellfish from any beds staked or cultivated by citizens. So it gave them the right to their fishing grounds, which had already been their fishing grounds, but it gives them, the government agrees that they have a right to their fishing grounds. So then in 1887, it comes into question through the court case of U.S. v. Taylor, whether or not Native people should still have a right to their fishing off-reservation locations, which were the same fishing grounds that were already covered in the treaty. They questioned whether or not they should still have a right to those lands, and it was decided that, yes, they do still, in fact, have a right to fish those lands. Around the early 1900s, as the cannery industry is growing in Washington, and they are developing new technologies and mechanisms for fishing that are eclipsing kind of the mechanisms for fishing that Native people could have. the area, Washington State, starts to put regulations on native fishings and begins to charge them fishing fees. So this is again going against the treaty that was signed. So there's a series of treaties, series of a series of court cases, series of protests. And then finally, we have the Boldt decision, which affirms and reconfirms for Native and Indigenous people that they have right to fish the lands that were theirs to begin with. So that is the USV Washington. It is, again, it's 1974. It's 1974 USV Washington, or the Boldt, B-O-L-D-T decision. Boldt is the judge who presided over the case, Judge George H. Boldt. Brown v. Board, or Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka's Board of Education, is the landmark court case that decides that separate but equal standards for racial segregation cannot exist, and therefore integrates schools and other public spaces, but particularly schools. And then the term symbolic acts are just these kinds of actions or events that symbolize something that represents a change. And he mentioned symbolic acts, so I want you all to have a clear understanding of what symbolic acts means. Okay, so these key concepts, again, come directly from the book. There's the story of what happened between the Lumbee people and the Klan in North Carolina, which is kind of a funny story, but you can look into that. What is the significance of the fish-ins? So the fish-ins are one of the things that lead up to the USV Washington case. Fish-ins was the practice in the 1960s of Native people fishing without permit, because again, these were their lands that were protected by treaties that then Washington State started to charge them fees for. So they're fishing without permit, and the fees come in the form of permits. They're fishing without permits as a protest in areas that should have been protected under the treaties with the U.S. in 1964. The fish-ins in the Pacific Northwest produced the first activism with an avowed goal or an openly declared goal to gain or regain their access to those fishing grounds. So the continued kind of back and forth in that area eventually results in the USV Washington, or the Boldt decision in 1974, which affirmed once and for all that all property rights of Northwest tribes for both substance and commercial fishing was rightfully theirs. It belonged to them. Okay, so this number 3, I want to make sure that I explain to you all what connections does the text make between the indigenous, between Indian and civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. So one of the things that the text claims, that Deloria claims, is that Indigenous people or Indians benefited substantially from the civil rights movement and the ensuing doctrines concerning the poor, which surfaced in the Economic Opportunities Act, and more particularly in its administration. The concept of equality developed and argued through the legal case brought by Greenberg and Marshall. That's the Brown v. Board of Education. What's significant about the Brown v. Board case and the argument that Greenberg and Marshall are making is that they use the Dahl test. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Dahl test, but you should take a look at it. There's several of them on YouTube. The Dahl test, D-O-L-L test, in the 1940s, Kenneth and Mamie Clark designed and conducted a series of experiments that become known as the Dahl test. They are kind of psychological, social science experiments. And the purpose of it is to look at the impact of segregation, not just on Black children or children of color, but on white children as well. And so they hold up 2 dolls to children to see how they assess these dolls. One doll is black or of darker hue, and the other dog is white or of lighter hue. And they hold these dolls up to children of a range of ages. And the consensus is basically the same. The results come back that most children, Black and white children alike, think that the black doll is the unattractive doll, it's the unintelligent doll, it's the bad doll, it's inherently all those things that are socially negative about Black people. And Black children are associating themselves with those negative constructs. And then the white dolls, Black and white children are experiencing the white dolls in the same as being good, as being beautiful or attractive, as being intelligent, and desirous, right? And so the doll test is used to argue that segregation is not, first of all, segregation was not equal. They were not receiving the same resources in Black and white schools, but that there is a psychological impact for separating children and segregating children out that's creating this assumption about Blackness as being inherently negative, inherently bad, inherently unattractive, inherently undesirable, and creating whiteness in just the polar opposite. So it becomes a very effective argument for ending segregation. The second connection that's made is because of the economic focus of the civil rights movement, which eventually becomes the people's movement. They have a focus on federal of developing what we call the war on poverty, or the federal government having the war on poverty for administrators to focus on the poor who knew better about what poverty was and how to combat it. And the civil rights movement becomes a part of the voice of that through the people's movement, that we need to have a focus on the poor and have a focus on poverty that doesn't allow for kind of a top-down analysis, but actually talks to poor people about the conditions that they're facing. So that is, I wanted you to understand those connections that they're drawing there. The other one that I wanted to talk to you about to make sure that you knew is, what is the distinction the author makes between the occupation of Alcatraz and the fishing rights fight, both fights for Native American rights, but they've yielded different results, right? And the Brown v. Board of Education litigations and the Black Power movement, both fights for Black rights that somehow yield different results. So what the fishing rights fights and Brown v. Board of Education have in common is that those sit-ins and fish-ins were almost certainly going to be honored because there was already a precedent set for them. And should activists be convicted at the trial level, those convictions would have to be overturned in the higher court, and the object of their protest would have to be upheld at the higher level of the litigation, because both the Brown and the Medicine Creek fishing rights treaties were already federal law before people went out and protested. They already had a legal foundation. They were already a part of federal legality that just wasn't being honored. Remember, de jure versus de facto. So these things are in law, but they're not being practiced. There had already been a number of cases that disallowed segregation in different spaces. There had already been a treaty that said that Indigenous people had rights to those waters. So when the protesters did their sit-ins and their fish-ins, they received more positive results because a law already existed, or precedence was already set for them. Whereas the movement on Alcatraz and the Black Power movement, which were also fights for the rights of Indigenous and Black people, yielded different results because they weren't fighting for a specific legal precedents. They weren't fighting for something that already existed. They were trying to establish and make new policies that weren't yet established. So there's different yielding of results. And often people consider both the Alcatraz movement and the Black Power movement unsuccessful. I would argue otherwise, but they consider them unsuccessful because unlike the sit-ins and the fish-ins, they didn't yield the same kinds of legal wins. So they're often considered unsuccessful. So I want you to understand that. The fish-ins and sit-ins already had a legal precedent. The Alcatraz movement and the Black Power movement did not have legal precedents already. They were trying to establish or make something new, right? And so they yield different results. Yeah, okay. So I think that about covers this particular reading. And I don't have any other slides for this one. Yeah. So you all do have a quiz for this week. I will send an email out about that quiz. The additional information in these lectures will be part of the quiz. So make sure that you pay close attention to the additional information that I'm giving you in these lectures. And take care of yourselves. Yeah, take care of yourselves.